She walked across that ballroom like she owned the world, and in a sense, she believed she did. What Vanessa Caldwell did not know, could not have imagined, in even her most paranoid midnight thoughts, was that she had signed the paperwork transferring that world to someone else approximately 11 months earlier. She had signed it cheerfully. In fact, she had signed it in a conference room in downtown Chicago while sipping sparkling water and congratulating herself on outmaneuvering a silent investment group she had never bothered to research properly. The man sitting at the opposite end of that conference table, the one whose face was partially obscured by the arrangement of documents her attorney had spread across the glass surface, had nodded quietly and accepted her handshake with a firm, unhurried grip. She had not recognized him. 10 years and a different haircut and a suit that cost more than her first car had done that to a person. His name, on the documents she had signed so confidently, was listed as a subsidiary holding entity. His actual name, the name she had known once, the name she had discarded along with him on a cold November evening a decade before, was Daniel Osei. I know exactly what happened next because that name is mine. Before we go any further, if you are the kind of person who believes that patience is not just a virtue, but a strategy, that the most powerful response to someone who underestimates you is to quietly become undeniable, then this channel is for you. Hit that like button, subscribe so you never miss a story, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from today, because this community has reached places I never expected, and every single one of you matters. Now, let us go back to the beginning of this, because the end means nothing without it. Hartwell University sits in the northwestern corner of Illinois, far enough from Chicago to feel like its own world, but close enough that ambitious students always had one eye pointed toward the skyline on clear days. I arrived there on a scholarship that I had worked 3 years of weekend tutoring jobs to supplement, because the gap between what Hartwell cost and what the scholarship covered was not small. And my parents, both of them teachers, in a small district in Ohio, were not in a position to close it without sacrificing things I refused to let them sacrifice. I knew what the scholarship had cost them emotionally, even if it had cost them nothing financially. My father had watched me drive away with the kind of quiet pride that never quite resolves into something he could say out loud, and my mother had pressed a card into my hand at the last moment that said simply, "You have always been more than enough." I kept that card. I still have it. The economics program at Hartwell was well regarded, and I had chosen it with the kind of deliberate intention that some people my age mistook for intensity. It was not intensity exactly, it was direction. I knew what I wanted to do with numbers and systems and the hidden logic of markets. And I had known it since I was 14 years old and had read a library copy of a book about the architecture of financial structures until its binding gave out. The program was everything I had hoped. The workload was serious. The professors were genuinely engaged. And in the second semester of my sophomore year, in a group project for a corporate strategy seminar, I met Vanessa Caldwell. She was the kind of beautiful that announces itself before you have processed what you are looking at. Sharp cheekbones, dark brown hair cut with architectural precision, and a way of holding a room's attention that felt less like charisma and more like gravity. She had grown up wealthy in a particular way that becomes invisible to the person inside it, not ostentatiously rich, but insulated from consequence in ways that had shaped her confidence into something that occasionally crossed the line into something harder. Her father ran a mid-sized event management and corporate hospitality company called Caldwell Meridian. It was a legitimate and fairly successful business built over 20 years with regional contracts across the Midwest. To Vanessa, it was simply the background of her existence, the financial architecture that made her life possible, and she spoke of it the way people speak of the weather, as a given, a constant, something that simply was. We worked together on that project for 6 weeks, and by the end of the 5th, I was in love with her in the way that is particular to 20-year-olds who have spent most of their lives prioritizing discipline over vulnerability. It arrived suddenly, and then it was simply there, enormous and unignorable. She felt something too, I believe then, and believe now. What she felt, however, may not have been the same thing I felt, and that distinction would take me 2 more years to fully understand. We dated for 2 years and 3 months. I can give you that number precisely because it was a specific period of my life, and I have never had any difficulty with precision. During that time, I met her parents twice. Her father, Gerald Caldwell, was a broad-shouldered man with the handshake of someone who had spent 20 years at networking events and the assessment gaze of someone who had spent those same 20 years deciding who was worth his time. He assessed me in approximately 8 seconds, and I watched his conclusion form across his face before he had consciously decided to reveal it. I was not what he had imagined for his daughter. I was not what he believed his daughter should want. He was polite about it, in the way that well-practiced people are polite about things they have already dismissed. Surface courtesy, not a single word of genuine engagement about my studies or my plans, and a handshake on departure that was technically warm and actually dismissive. Vanessa noticed none of this, or she noticed and decided that noticing was not useful. Her mother, Patricia, was quieter and more careful, and I sensed something different in her. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of troubled attention, as though she was watching something unfold that she was not certain about, but felt powerless to affect. We never had a real conversation. There were too many polite obstacles in the way. The 2 years were not uniformly painful. There were genuine stretches of happiness, real tenderness, moments that I carry still with a complicated mixture of gratitude and grief. But there were fault lines from the beginning, and they ran along a very specific geological formation, Vanessa's understanding of where I fit in the landscape of her life. I was brilliant, she told me once, in a tone that made the word feel like a consolation prize. I was so determined, she said another time, which, in context, meant that she found my ambition slightly exhausting, slightly inconvenient, slightly out of proportion to what she considered my reasonable prospects. She believed, I think, that I was reaching, that my plans for graduate study, for building something real in the financial sector, were the dreams of someone who did not fully understand which table he had been allowed to sit at. She never said this directly. She did not need to. It lived in the small inflections, the tiny reframings, the way she introduced me to her parents' friends as Daniel, he's in economics, with a pause before economics that somehow communicated a question mark. The end came in November of our senior year, and it came in a way I have thought about many times since, because of the particular texture of its cruelty, which I do not believe Vanessa intended as cruelty, and which was therefore somehow worse. She called me to a coffee shop on a Tuesday afternoon, a place we had been to dozens of times, and she told me, with genuine kindness in her voice, genuine, I believed it then, and I believe it now, that she did not think we were right for each other in the long run. That she cared about me deeply, that she thought I was going to do great things, she really did, but that she needed someone whose life was moving on the same track as hers. She was going back to work with her father after graduation. She was going to run Caldwell Meridian eventually. She needed someone who could fit into that world, who understood it, who would be an asset to it in a particular social and professional sense. It was November of our senior year, the same cold month 4 years later that she had once made feel like the only month that mattered. I was not that person. She said it with such careful gentleness that it took me several minutes after leaving the coffee shop to understand what had actually been communicated. It was not simply that she was ending our relationship. It was that she was explaining to me, with perfect clarity, that I was not sufficient, that the gap between where I came from and where she was going was not bridgeable by intelligence or determination or love. That I was, in some fundamental way she could not quite name, but clearly felt, not enough. I drove back to my apartment, and I sat at my desk for approximately 1 hour without moving. Then I opened my laptop, and I went back to work on a financial modeling project I had been developing with one of my professors. I do not say this to perform toughness. I say it because it is what happened, and because the work was the only thing in that moment that felt like solid ground. Numbers do not leave. Systems do not decide. You are insufficient. The logic of markets does not require you to be a certain kind of person. I graduated that May. I moved to Chicago. I took a position as an analyst at a mid-tier investment firm with the specific plan of learning everything I could about capital markets, distressed assets, and acquisition strategy, the unglamorous machinery of how ownership actually changes hands. I also enrolled in a part-time MBA program at night, which I funded by working the kind of hours that left marks on a person, the kind of marks that are not visible from the outside, but that restructure something fundamental about how you understand the relationship between effort and possibility. I did not think about Vanessa often. When I did, it was not with bitterness exactly. It was with a kind of clear-eyed recognition of what had happened, and a quiet, private, entirely undramatic resolve to build something that needed no one's permission to be real. The following 7 years were not a fairy tale. They were work. Relentless, specific, strategic work. I moved through that first firm and then to a second larger one, learning the particular art of identifying companies that were structurally sound but financially distressed, businesses with real assets and real market positions that were being undermined by poor capital management, over-leverage, or ownership transitions gone wrong. By the time I was 28, I had been involved in 4 significant acquisition processes and had developed a reputation in a specific niche of the Chicago financial market as someone who saw things other analysts missed and who was extraordinarily patient in executing a strategy once he had identified it. At 30, with 2 partners, I had developed deep professional trust with over years of shared work. I established Ose Reinhold Capital, a private equity and acquisition firm focused specifically on the mid-market, hospitality, and events management sector. It was not a glamorous niche. It was not the kind of firm that generated newspaper profiles. It was, however, extraordinarily well-positioned because it was built on real expertise, real relationships, and a genuine understanding of an industry that most large capital firms considered too unglamorous to study carefully, which meant that we saw things they missed, which meant that over the next 5 years, we built something that was by any honest measure remarkable. It was through this work that Caldwell Meridian first appeared on my radar. I want to be precise about this because it matters. I did not go looking for it. I was not conducting a decade-long scheme of revenge. I was building a business in a sector where Caldwell Meridian was simply one of the companies that existed, and it appeared in our portfolio analysis because it met our acquisition criteria. It was structurally sound, good client relationships, solid regional contracts, a real market position, but it had serious capital management problems that had emerged over the previous 3 years, partly from aggressive expansion Gerald Caldwell had undertaken before a market downturn softened the events industry, and partly from a management transition that had been handled poorly when Gerald had begun stepping back to address some health concerns. Vanessa had taken over operational leadership 2 years earlier, and while she was capable in certain respects, she had inherited her father's appetite for expansion without his tactical patience, and the company was now carrying debt at a ratio that made its medium-term position genuinely precarious. We identified it. We built a thesis around it. We structured an acquisition approach through a subsidiary holding entity, which is standard practice for competitive reasons. You do not broadcast your intentions in this sector if you want to acquire at fair value rather than at an inflated panic premium. The process took 11 months from initial identification to sign documents. Vanessa negotiated hard, and I will give her that credit honestly. She believed she had found an investment partner who would provide capital infusion while leaving operational control substantially with her. The agreement did provide for a transition period of 18 months during which she retained the title of Chief Operating Officer with defined autonomous authority in specified areas. What it also contained, in language that her attorney had reviewed and accepted, was a comprehensive framework of performance benchmarks and a board composition structure that gave O.C. Reinhold decisive governance authority from the date of signing. She shook my hand across that conference table in downtown Chicago. A different attorney had handled her side of the negotiations. The face across the table, as I have said, was not fully visible to her through the arrangement of documents. She was looking at papers, not at people, which is a habit that had cost her before, and had now cost her in a way she did not yet know. The homecoming event at Hartwell University was an annual affair that had grown over the years into something considerably more elaborate than a simple alumni gathering. A full weekend of events culminating in a formal dinner and gala at the Hartwell Grand Ballroom, which the university had renovated handsomely with donor funding. It attracted alumni from across the decades, and it had, in recent years, developed a reputation as the kind of event where people went to measure themselves against the people they had once been and the people they had once known. I had not attended in the 10 years. Since graduation, I attended this one because one of my former professors, Dr. Elaine Marcus, who had supervised that financial modeling project in my senior year, and had been quietly influential in ways she had never sought credit for, was being honored with a Lifetime Achievement Award, and she had personally invited me. I respected her enormously. I would not have missed it. I arrived at the ballroom on a Saturday evening in October, wearing a charcoal suit that had been made for me by a tailor in Chicago's Gold Coast district, and carrying nothing in my hands and nothing on my face except a calm that was genuine rather than performed. I had not thought about who else might be there. I had thought about Dr. Marcus and about what I wanted to say when I saw her. That was the full extent of my mental preparation for that evening. I should have remembered that Caldwell Meridian had a corporate hospitality contract with Hartwell University. I should have remembered that the annual homecoming gala was exactly the kind of high-visibility alumni event that a company like Caldwell Meridian would manage, would staff, and would use as an opportunity to network. I should have remembered that Vanessa, who had taken over operational leadership and who had always understood the social architecture of these events better than their logistics, would almost certainly be present, not merely as an alumna, but as the person running the event. But I should have remembered all of this. The fact that I did not is, in retrospect, the universe's way of ensuring that what happened next occurred naturally rather than as the product of any deliberate plan on my part. I saw her from across the room before she saw me. She was standing near the event registration table in a midnight blue dress, holding a small tablet and speaking to one of her event staff, with the particular authority of someone who is both host and executive in charge of the room in two different capacities simultaneously. She looked essentially the same as I remembered, decade older in ways that had resolved into something more precise and assured. And for a single moment, I felt something that was not quite the old feeling, but was related to it, a ghost of recognition that passed quickly and cleanly through me and left no residue. Then her gaze swept the room in the practiced way of someone managing an event and looking for problems, and it landed on me, and I watched the sequence of recognitions move across her face, first the general impression, then the specific retrieval, then a kind of recalibration as she processed the gap between the Daniel Osei she had stored in memory and the one currently standing in her ballroom. The recalibration produced, I noted, a small and involuntary smile that she redirected almost immediately into something more controlled. She came over. I had expected she might not. The fact that she did told me something. "Daniel," she said. Her voice carried the particular warmth of someone who has decided, in the 2 seconds of walking across a room, exactly how they want to frame an encounter. "My goodness. It's been, what, 10 years?" "Just about," I said. "You look well." She said this with a tone that appended an unspoken surprisingly to the front of the sentence. And that tone, that small and perhaps unconscious attachment, was enough to remind me of every other small inflection from the 2 years we had shared. "Thank you," I said. "You've put together a beautiful event." She accepted this with a nod that managed to be both gracious and proprietary. "Caldwell Meridian has been the university's hospitality partner for 4 years now. We've really made it something." And then, with the smoothness of someone who does it often and effortlessly. "So, what brings you back to Hartwell? Are you in Chicago now? What are you doing with yourself these days?" The phrase, "what are you doing with yourself?" is interesting. It is not, "what have you built?" or "what have you accomplished?" It is the question you ask when you expect the answer to be modest, when you are essentially offering the other person a conversational courtesy before returning to more interesting subjects. I recognized it immediately because I had heard its relatives many times over the years from people who had formed an impression and were graciously inviting me to confirm it. "I'm in Chicago." "Yes," I said. "Private equity, mostly. Mid-market acquisitions. I run a firm with 2 partners, Osei Reinhold Capital." She nodded in a way that indicated she had processed the words without updating the picture. "That sounds very interesting," she said, deploying the phrase that people use when something sounds neither interesting nor relevant to them. "Finance was always your thing." Another small inflection. Your thing, meaning a thing particular to me, perhaps a quirk, a hobby of the professional variety, certainly not something she needed to take seriously. And then she did something that I think she had not planned, that emerged from a combination of the easy confidence of someone managing her own event and the accumulated habit of 10 years of operating in environments where she held the social authority. She half-turned toward the entrance of the ballroom where a small group of people had just arrived, and she said to me, with a lightness that was almost friendly, almost affectionate, almost kind, almost, "Well, it's good that things worked out for you, Daniel." It really is. Not everyone from our year figured it out. You know, some people they were better at the classroom than at real life. She gave a small, warm laugh. "You were always such a hard worker. I used to worry about you. Honestly, you were so serious." The laugh again, softer this time. "I'm glad you found your lane." "I found your lane." It was perfectly executed. It was so skillfully delivered that someone listening from a moderate distance would have heard warmth, affection even. A former girlfriend expressing genuine pleasure at a former boyfriend's adequate development. What it actually communicated with precision and efficiency was this: "You were never quite enough. I was right to leave you. I see you have managed to do something serviceable with your life, and I am pleased that you have made peace with your limitations." "Thank you, Vanessa," I said. "I appreciate that." She smiled once more, the full wattage of it, the version that had once made me feel chosen, and then excused herself to attend to her event, and I watched her walk back across the ballroom toward a group of people that included what I recognized as several significant Hartwell donors, and I felt, very clearly and very precisely, a specific sensation that was not anger and was not hurt. It was something closer to the feeling you get when you have been carrying a weight for a very long time, and you set it down, and you realize, standing in the absence of it, that you are fine, that you were fine all along. Elaine Marcus found me approximately 20 minutes later near the bar, where I had been having a genuinely good conversation with 2 alumni I had not seen since graduation. She was in her early 70s, and moved with the deliberate energy of someone who had decided that the pace of the world was slightly too fast for good thinking, and had accordingly refused to match it. She took both my hands in hers and looked at me with the particular focused attention she had always given her best students, the kind that made you feel examined and valued simultaneously. "Daniel," she said, "you look like yourself." Finally and completely, it was perhaps the finest thing anyone has ever said to me. The dinner was excellent. The award ceremony was moving. Dr. Marcus gave a speech that was funny and incisive and wise in the way that only someone who has watched hundreds of young people move through the world can be wise. and she used it to say things about the nature of potential and the danger of measuring it by surface indicators that landed in that room, in ways I suspect she understood would land and probably could not help. I caught Vanessa's face during the speech. She was applauding at the appropriate moments. I do not know what she heard. Afterward, as the dinner tables were cleared and the dancing portion of the evening began, I was approached by two men I had not met before: Thomas Calloway, a Hartwell trustee and longtime donor, and his colleague Frank Esposito, who ran a regional commercial real estate operation that had worked with Caldwell Meridian on several projects. They had heard my name from Dr. Marcus, they said, who had apparently mentioned me in conversation earlier in the evening. They wanted to talk about a regional development project they were exploring and whether a firm like Osei Reinhold might be interested in a consulting relationship. We were standing near one of the large bay windows at the edge of the ballroom, the three of us in conversation that had the easy but substantive rhythm of people who speak the same professional language, when Vanessa appeared again. She was with a third man I did not recognize, a tall, silver-haired figure who had the particular bearing of old regional money, the kind that does not need to announce itself, and she was clearly steering him toward Thomas Calloway with the practiced purposefulness of a person managing relationships at a networking event. She was, I realized, doing her job. She was excellent at it. I will not take that from her. She saw me standing with Calloway and Esposito, and something shifted in her expression. Not dramatically, just a small tightening around the eyes, a recalibration of the scene she had walked into. She introduced the silver-haired man, who was named Prescott Hale, and who was evidently a significant potential client for Caldwell Meridian. And then she turned to me with the tone of someone graciously including a lesser guest in an important conversation. Daniel was just telling me about his work in finance. She offered to the group with a smile that was simultaneously inclusive and diminishing, the smile that places you in a category while appearing to welcome you from it. Small-scale acquisitions, I think. You said, she turned to me. Private investment, is that right? The question contained several small blades. Small scale. Is that right? As though she was not entirely certain she had remembered correctly, as though my field of work was not quite memorable enough to have retained with confidence. Thomas Calloway looked at me with a slight shift in his expression, the look of a man recalculating something. Actually, he said, Elaine tells us Osei Reinhold has been quite active in the events and hospitality sector. He paused, in the way of a man who has done his research and is preparing to produce it. You're the firm that acquired Meridian Holdings Group last year, aren't you? And the Carson Events Network. The silence that followed was approximately 4 seconds long. I have rarely heard 4 seconds speak so clearly. Vanessa's face did something complicated and arrived somewhere she had not intended to arrive. I looked at Calloway and said, yes, that's right. Meridian and Carson were both acquisitions that fit our regional thesis. We're also in the process of finalizing a third in the sector. I did not look at Vanessa. I did not need to. We've been building what we think is a meaningful platform in Midwest hospitality and events infrastructure. Prescott Hale, the silver-haired potential client who had come over to discuss business with Caldwell Meridian's principal, turned to look at Vanessa with an expression that asked, silently but clearly, whether she had known this and why she had not mentioned it. She had not known. That much was visible. But something else was also happening behind her eyes, the specific cognitive vertigo of a person rapidly re-examining a signed document, a conference table, a face partially obscured by arranged papers, and arriving at a conclusion that was restructuring everything around her. She said very quietly, Osei Reinhold. Not a question. Recognition. Yes, I said, still not unkindly. You're... She stopped. The investment group. The acquiring entity. That was... Another stop. Her composure was remarkable. Actually, she had always been composed under pressure. I had always respected that about her. You're the silent partner. I'm the managing partner, I said, The same tone I would have used to confirm any professional fact. There's nothing particularly silent about it. The entity structure is standard practice for acquisitions in this sector. You'll find it in the governance documents your attorney reviewed. Thomas Calloway and Frank Esposito had the social grace to be extremely interested in their drinks. Prescott Hale was watching with the unabashed attention of a man who had seen many things in business and found this more interesting than most. Vanessa looked at me for a long moment, and I saw the full sequence of it move through her. The recalibration of the last 10 years, the Tuesday afternoon in the coffee shop, the man who was not sufficient, the lane she had graciously suggested. I find the documents she had signed across a glass conference table while congratulating herself on a successful negotiation, all of it arriving simultaneously in the space of that look, landing in the specific way that truth lands when it has been withheld, not through deception, but simply through the natural passage of time and the consequences of one's own choices. "Daniel," she said, and for the first time that evening, all of the register adjustments and social calculations were absent from her voice. It was just the word and the voice beneath all the surfaces. "I owe you an apology." "You don't," I said, and I meant it absolutely. You made decisions that made sense to you at the time, with the information you had. I made decisions that made sense to me. They led us both here. I paused for a moment. The transition period under the acquisition agreement is 18 months. Your operational authority during that period is clearly defined, and it's real. I intend to honor it completely, and the company has good bones, and I think we can build something significant together, professionally speaking, if we work with the structure we've agreed to." She held my gaze for a few seconds more, and I saw something move through her that was more complicated than embarrassment, more substantive than surprise. It was the particular feeling, I think, of understanding that the person you had measured and found wanting had not, in the intervening decade, spent any time thinking about being found wanting, had instead simply built, had built and built and built until the building led, without any plan or intention, to a room where they were standing with governance authority over everything you had inherited and assumed was permanent. "Good bones," she said, very quietly, almost to herself. It was not quite a laugh, but it was adjacent to one, the involuntary acknowledgement of an irony too large and too precise to do anything with, except accept. She straightened her posture, that old reflex, that familiar dignity. "I'll reach out to your office Monday to schedule a proper briefing. I'll have my assistant confirm the time," I said. Prescott Hale turned back to Vanessa with a new quality of attention, the kind that comes when someone's professional position has been suddenly and dramatically recontextualized. Their conversation, when it resumed, had a different texture to it. The Caldwell meridian she was representing was no longer entirely hers to represent in the way she had believed it was. Everything she said would now carry the implicit acknowledgement that there was a larger framework above it. She handled it professionally. She always would. That is simply who she was, and I respected it then as I had always. Underneath everything, respected the real capabilities that her particular brand of arrogance had sometimes obscured. I spent another hour at the gala. I talked with Dr. Marcus for 20 minutes near the end of the evening, standing by the window with the October dark pressed against the glass outside. I told her some of what had happened in the years since graduation, not all of it, but enough that she could see the shape of it. She listened with the complete attention she had always given to things worth hearing, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You know what the real work was," she said eventually. "Not the acquisitions, not the capital. The part where you didn't become what they expected you to become. That's the harder thing to build. First, I drove back to Chicago that night with the windows down despite the cold, the interstate open and dark ahead of me, the skyline appearing eventually on the horizon like the answer to a question you have been working on for a long time. I thought about my father's face at the end of the driveway. I thought about my mother's card. I thought about the financial modeling project and the desk I had sat at for an hour without moving on a November evening, and all the mornings after it, where I had simply gotten up and gone back to work. I thought about what Dr. Stent Marcus had said. I thought about the fact that I did not feel triumphant, precisely. What I felt was something quieter and more durable than triumph. It was the feeling of having been true to something, to a way of working, a way of treating people, a set of standards I had carried, not because anyone was watching, but because they were mine, and of having arrived somewhere worth arriving at because of that consistency and not in spite of it. The ballroom and Vanessa and the precise theatrical irony of it all. The signed documents, the conference table, the unrecognized face, those things were real, and they had happened, and I would not pretend they carried no weight. But they were not the point. They had never been the point. The point was the work, and what the work had made possible, and who I had been during it. The professional relationship with Caldwell Meridian over the following 18 months was, by any objective measure, productive. Vanessa was a good operator when she had the right resources behind her and the right governance framework around her, and Osei Reinhold provided both. The company's debt position was resolved in the first 8 months. 2 new regional contracts were signed. The expansion strategy was restructured with more disciplined timing and appropriate capital support. Gerald Caldwell, who had been watching from a partially retired position and who was apparently told by his daughter the full story of who the acquiring entity's managing partner was, reached out to me personally 3 months into the transition. He asked to meet for coffee. I agreed. He was older, heavier, and had the particular aspect of a man who had recently been through health challenges that had adjusted his perspective on certain things. He sat across from me, and he did not make small talk for long before saying, with a directness I had not expected from him, "I was wrong about you. Back then, I was wrong about what I saw when I looked at you." He looked down at his coffee for a moment. "I've been wrong about a few things. Vanessa tells me you've been straight with her, that the deal has been run clean. I wanted you to hear from me that I noticed." I told him I appreciated it. I told him, and this was also true, that the company he had built over 20 years was the reason the acquisition made sense, that the foundation was real and the problems had been correctable ones, and that when I looked at Caldwell Meridian, I saw someone's genuine work and I had treated it as such. He nodded slowly at that, and I think it was the thing he had needed to hear, not because it exonerated anything, but because it meant that what he had built had not been carelessly handled by the person who now held it. We finished our coffee and shook hands at the door of the cafe, and I walked back to my car and drove to a meeting that was waiting for me, and I thought about the first time we had shaken hands, the dismissive warmth of it, the assessment in his eyes, the conclusion he had formed in 8 seconds, and I thought about how thoroughly time and work and simple integrity had revised every assumption in that handshake without a single moment of deliberate confrontation. That is the thing about quiet determination that the arrogant and the certain never understand until it is upon them. It does not announce itself. It does not defend itself. It does not require your belief or your permission or your assessment of its likelihood. It simply continues. It continues through the Tuesday afternoon coffee shops and the 11 months of acquisition structuring and the October gala ballrooms and the unrecognized faces across glass conference tables. It continues because it is not performing for anyone. It is only ever building, and what it builds, given enough time, is undeniable. If this story stayed with you, if you know something about being underestimated, about working in the quiet, about arriving somewhere that proved a point you never needed to make out loud, I want to hear from you in the comments below. Where are you in your own story right now? Are you in the building years, the years where no one quite sees it yet? Or have you reached a moment where the work finally spoke for itself? Tell me. And If you believe that the most powerful thing a person can do is refuse to be defined by someone else's ceiling, then this channel has more stories for you. Like this video, subscribe, and come back because the next one is waiting.